I'm totally in awe of doing this. As you can imagine, I'm used to talking to perhaps a lounge room full of people, but never a whole heap of flyers, my gosh. Anyway, maybe most of you wouldn't have flown in the 50s. Who has? A few. I was born in Perth in 37, and before you start working it out, I'm 86 next month. And in those days, flying was something that we knew nothing about. It was the Cinderella state with a vengeance, wasn't it? That Nullarbor plane separated us from the east, and you didn't even drive it unless you had a boot full of spares. And flying, I didn't know anybody who'd flown until the parents of the fathers of some of my friends came back from the war, very damaged. And it was particularly, I think, the Fliers who had taken the knocks and done a very dangerous job. However, when I was 18, my dad took me to Sydney on a business trip, and I flew. And I was hooked, absolutely hooked, but wondered how I'd ever get in the air again, until the older sister of a friend of mine, who had joined MMA in its infancy and become the assistant chief hostess and therefore the training hostess, said, "You'd love it, Trish, get on board." So I applied and learned that you had to be 21. And I do understand that. We were very young 21-year-olds in those days, and there was a fair amount of responsibility. And you had to be single. So the possibilities of flying for a long period of time were limited because there was no pill. We got married young. Most of us about 23 or 24. And it certainly happened to me. I was required to complete a first aid certificate and also a home nursing certificate before applying, and I did that. And then we were required to do a test flight, simply because most of the hosties who applied had never been in the air, and it was known that those planes were full of turbulence and maybe the hostie wouldn't survive one trip. Some didn't and withdrew their applications. Anyway, on a Sunday afternoon, my parents took me out to Guildford, and I boarded a flight for Kalgoorlie return, and my mother later told me I came back with stars in my eyes. And so I began my training in 58 when I turned 21. The training was very brief. I had a couple of test flights with Margaret, my friend, and suddenly I was on my own with 2 pilots and 28 passengers, and a lot of responsibility and not very much glamour, let me tell you. Let me tell you about a trip north. We would be collected at our home, mine in Wembley, at 3 o'clock in the morning by a dispatch clerk or a taxi driver, driven to the central office in Perth, to catch the bus with most of the passengers going out to Guildford on the bus. Arriving there 4 o'clock in the morning to rush out to the plane, make sure we had all the stock, also that we had what we needed in the buffet, and to make to fill the urns with tea in a infuser, and another one with hot water, and another one with the infamous eggs. The only hot food we ever could serve on an DC-3 was eggs for breakfast, boiled eggs. Everything else was cold. We had no heated buffet. And so it was a guessing game. You put 50 eggs in something and cook them and hope that they turn out well. Sometimes breakfast was without eggs. It was just the cereal and bread and butter, no toast, and some fruit, because the eggs were either as hard as bullets or running. The hostie then, of course, had to settle the passengers while The first officer was the busy one, rushing about making sure that all the luggage was stowed appropriately and telling the hostie where they could sit the passengers, which was always not a joy because some of the passengers were very familiar with the trips and they sat where they liked. There were no allocated seats in those days. But once we were airborne, you were busy. We were up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, Learmont, Onslow, Geraldton, you just went on, Roban, it just went on and on and on and on until we got to Headland. And very often the pilots would be offloaded at Headland because they'd completed their hours. But we didn't have an award, and so we stayed on board and flew on to Derby, arriving probably about 14 hours after we'd been picked up from our homes that morning. It was a long day, especially because the turbulence was terrific up there. The DC-3s were, I know, an amazing plane. They opened up the north. Until then it was the state ships that took everything north because the roads were so poor. But those planes were, apart from being workhorses, they were so uncomfortable. They vibrated terribly. They were extremely noisy, poorly insulated, and we could only fly at 8,000 feet. We were not pressurized. You can imagine how hard that was in turbulence. There were a few occasions when the pilot would tell you, go and sit down. We're going up to 10,000 because the turbulence was so bad that everybody was sick. And that's what you would have to do. And of course it could be very hot on the plane, and the food of course was very ordinary, had to be. And the hostie had in all of this usually to wash up after a meal because the cutlery and so on would be needed again for the next leg. So you never sat down, you were busy all the time, especially if people were sick, looking after them. And finally, as I say, you with a new air crew would arrive at Derby in time to collapse, only to get ready next day to fly back again and do the whole thing again. Of course, we did lots of short flights. In those days, we flew to Rottnest at the weekends in the DC-3s. No one believes me when I tell them that, but they did. Competing for the airstrip with Jimmy Woods, and that was interesting too. He was a law unto himself and he did some crazy things. I remember one day we were held up waiting for him to take off, and he still had a luggage trailer attached to the back of the plane as he was cascading down the runway. Another time at the airstrip, we couldn't take off on one of our trips because Jimmy was up there. He was trying to lessen his fuel load because he didn't have any undercarriage. He couldn't get the undercarriage down. And finally got one wheel down and brought the plane in, of course. He was an interesting man. But let me tell you about Headland, because Headland was probably our headquarters. It was primitive in the extreme in those days. It had two pubs. One, of course, wasn't fit for human habitation, we thought. The other was the Esplanade, and that's where we stayed. We had 3 rooms, one for 2 hosties and 2 rooms with 2 beds for pilots. Most of the time, the pilots slept on the veranda and usually spent their days eating on the veranda, drinking cups of tea, and swatting for their next exam, their next upgrade. We acquired an old Dodge Tourer, open-top Tourer, and whoever was in town was able to use the Tourer, put the petrol in, and get to the beach and so on, because there was so little to do. I remember one trip I happened to be a spare hostess, and there wasn't a room for me with air crew, which was our permanent area on the veranda. And so I had a room elsewhere in the hotel. And the first time I came out of it, there was an old man, absolutely stark as facing me, drunk as a skunk, and he'd forgotten to get dressed. The first time I landed at Headland, I said to aircrew, "Let's eat, I'm starving." I was always starving then. And they said, "Well, be our guest, we're not going down." I said, "Well, what are you eating?" And they said, "What we always eat, what we take off the planes and what we managed to buy at the one very ordinary store in town." So I went down to dinner on my own and ordered soup, and I swear to you, it arrived with a cockroach in it. The first and last meal I ever ate at Headland. We had lots of different sorts of flights. I mean, obviously there were shorter ones down to Albany at that stage, a round trip to Kalgoorlie, Esperance, Albany home, and all over the state. Some of those trips were charters, and I would turn up at the airport and have an unusual list of passengers, often well-dressed, foreign, and wonder who they were. And the pilots would offload them somewhere up north and we'd go back on our own. And I remember one such trip, one of the pilots saying to me, "Sit down, open a book or the newspaper and go blind." I wondered what he was talking about, until later in the flight, suddenly the engine noise changed. I looked out of the window and I could see the prop. They'd feathered an engine. Totally illegal, but that's the way they practiced when there wasn't anyone around. It wouldn't have been worth my life to have reported them, that's for sure. Other flights were interesting too. I remember the first time I arrived at Guildford and they said, "We're taking a team of shearers out." Boy, were they rough guys, terrifying. This is early in the morning and they're going out to do the shearing on several properties over a 3-week period, and it's dry. They do not have any alcohol while they're working those farms. So guess what? They're all as drunk at the airport first thing in the morning. And I said to the pilots, "What do I do?" I was terrified once again. And they said, don't worry. We'll handle it. If you have any trouble at all, buzz us and one of us will come and sort it out. But we're assuring you, you won't have any trouble at all." So we got airborne, and sure enough, the pilots turned up the heating, and that whole lot snored the whole way there. We offloaded a very sorry-looking lot, I can tell you. And of course, they would have been paid out at the end of 3 weeks, got on the plane full again, and it would have been another poor hostie's job to get them back to Guildford. I remember one day, I'm just reminiscing, I hope it's what you wanted to hear from me. Another day I was suddenly aware of the fact that I could smell smoke. Now, we didn't serve any alcohol on our planes. I mean, we had no way of keeping it cold, we had nowhere to store it, and it was a dangerous thing to even contemplate. But people smoked in those days. There were ashtrays in the armrests. And I went looking for the source of the smell and realised we had taken on a passenger who had been drinking at the last port of call. He was sound asleep. He'd lit a cigarette, dropped it as he slept, and there was a little fire burning at his feet, which I had to eliminate with the extinguisher. Went forward and told the pilots, and he was put out at the next port of call. We carried a lot of very, very sick people. In those days, medical establishments up north were just about non-existent. They were nursing stations and not much more. And if there was anybody very sick, thank you, they would have to be brought into Derby or Headland or one of those places and brought down on a regular flight. There was the Royal Flying Doctor Service at the time, but few planes, and if they had been responsible for bringing a patient right down to Perth, it would have put them out of action for far too long. They couldn't afford it. So they would bring them into these headquarters, and I tell you, if you arrived at the strip and there was an ambulance waiting, your heart sank because you were busy. You had a lot to do, and it was one more duty. Very often they would have to take 2 of the seats out of the plane and strap and stretcher to the floor. And for those very, very long trips, that person would just lie there, vibrating. And we were trained in giving morphine because sometimes they were extremely ill. I do remember one trip going out to take the passengers aboard, and they had already sat a man in the back seat of the plane, and he looked cadaverous. He was so thin and so ill-looking. And by the time we got to Guildford and we offloaded him, he was red from the waist down. He'd been bleeding the whole time. Another time, I got out to the plane to get the passengers aboard, and there was an Aboriginal man sitting in the back seat in a straitjacket. I'd never seen a straitjacket. There he was, strapped in, and of course he sat like that for that long trip, and every time I tried to feed him anything, he just bit the spoon. I gave up after a while. Every trip was a challenge. The noise was so great that the pilots could not communicate with the passengers, couldn't tell them any of the vital information that might have been needing to be transferred to them. So the company had brought out cards that had the date, the plane name, the destination, where we'd left, our ETA, and possibly the weather or whatever was relevant. And I remember going forward busily to be buzzed and go forward and get a couple of these cards from the pilots, whip back and hand them to the people in the front seats so that they could read them and pass them back. Didn't even look at them. After a while I turned round and realised there was a lot of giggling going on. The pilots had been bored, and they were very often bored on those long hauls. They always put the plane on George and then got up to mischief, especially if they could terrorise the hostie. And there were these 2 information sheets. We were flying in rust buckets something or other between Bullamakanka and Timbuktu, and ETA was a question mark, and it was just funny. The whole thing was well written, but obviously not for human consumption. And so about half an hour later, I was buzzed again, went forward, and they handed me 2 of these cards. And I said, I don't think you better show your faces down the front, fellas. And they said, what do you mean? I said, I handed out the last 2. They, you didn't. You didn't even look at them. No, I didn't. So the pilots who used to love putting on their cap and sauntering out and showing their faces on the flight to the passengers and whatever, never showed their faces on that flight. There was another flight that was amusing too, in that because of the vibration, the door of the cockpit had blown open, and I was busy down the back, turned around and was amused to see people sitting on the aisle looking forward into the cabin, into the cockpit, and realised that the 2 pilots were giving them a show, because in those days, of course, we were known as Mickey Mouse Airlines, MMA, and the Mickey Mouse Club was very, very well known in America, and they had their own headgear, which was a black sort of skull cap with Mickey Mouse ears on it, and they had a tune that went with their program. And there were our pilots sitting up the front doing MICKEYMOUSE, and that was another trip. The pilots never showed their faces. A lot of the things that happen to the hosties are folklore, I know that, but one story was always good. It's in Reg's book, which incidentally, some of you probably have. Reg Adkins and I flew together. He was a first officer then, very new to the job, and when he self-published his memoir, I sent for a copy, and it really takes me back. But this story tells of a hostie who was pretty new and pretty green. Not all of them were very bright, not all of them, I have to confess. And she was buzzed to go forward, and the captain said to her, "Now, you need to know this," he said, "because of the vibration of these planes," he said, the main door could fly open." He said, "Do be very careful, because if you're near it, you're out into the slipstream." So he said, "Let me show you what I mean." Well, in those days, the pilots could fly with the windows open. 8,000 feet, it wasn't a problem. So he leaned toward the window with his tie on, and flip, it went out into the slipstream. This lass was suitably impressed, went back, got on with doing things, and forgot about the conversation for some time until she was buzzed to go forward again. When she did, she went forward to see what the pilots wanted. There was no one there. The windows were open. They were in the luggage compartments. They said the yell could be heard on Earth. She thought she was flying the plane. And they were good at that sort of thing. A lot of the flying went out, of course, to the station properties, and they were interesting trips. Those families were very isolated. Max did much to open up services to the stations because we had the mail charter, and we took a lot of their perishables and a lot of the goods that were transported to and from, including the children's lessons, because at primary school level, of course, they had radio school. And I can remember going out to these stations, and a lady of the house would have come out to the strip as with the rest of the family, and usually brought thermoses of tea and scones and jam and cream, goat's cream usually. We loved those trips. And I can remember the children on one occasion coming to me with their lessons and saying, "Tell Mrs. Brown I've done the very best I can," as though we were personally in touch with the teachers. And of course, that meant that I just put them in the mailbag. So it was a hard life. There was no glamour. We were busy. We never stopped. And I think I was tired for 2 years because of flying at that level. But it was a very valuable experience for me. I married at 23, went abroad and was abroad for many years at a time when Australia was still an unknown place. It was still Crocodile Dundee territory to a lot of people. And I was able to tell them about the real outback, which was valuable.